The first thing I noticed was the smell. It was like wet, old paper, moldy, heavy, the kind of thing that seeps into the walls and never leaves. The archive room felt like it had been forgotten for decades, even though it was still used almost every day. Working there was a sentence. Yellowed, cracked walls, fluorescent lights flickering now and then, and the kind of silence only a municipal building basement can offer. My name is Caleb. I'm 32. I have a degree in public administration that led me nowhere, and I work a dull job as an archivist at the Montrose Municipal Documentation Center in Colorado. Most of the time, I work alone. My colleagues only pop in to grab a paper or drop off more boxes of documents. Today, I was buried up to my neck in tax forms from the 80s, trying not to lose my mind with the ticking of the wall clock. You're always here, aren't you? The voice caught me by surprise. It was Linda from accounting. She rarely spoke to me, and honestly, I preferred it that way. Yeah, always, I replied, without looking up from what I was doing. Doesn't this place ever get to you? Not at all, I lied, glancing at her quickly. Linda was the type to act superior. Even the way she crossed her arms made it clear she thought I was insignificant. Well, I heard they're bringing in more boxes tomorrow. Maybe you should think about changing careers. Her sarcasm was sharp, but I just nodded. It wasn't worth arguing. What Linda didn't know, and maybe no one did, was that I needed this job. Not just for the money, but for what it offered. Anonymity. Here, I could be invisible. No one asked questions. No one cared. But that day, something changed. While rummaging through one of the boxes, I found an envelope. Unlike the other documents, it wasn't stamped or dated. It was smooth, slightly crumpled, and looked out of place. My instinct was to ignore it, but something about it bothered me. I looked around, even though I knew I was alone. Then I opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded carelessly. The text seemed typewritten, with irregular letters that looked like they'd been made by an old machine. The message was simple. You are not who you think you are. Not even what they think you are. Find out more in Cabinet 237. My heart skipped a beat, but I tried to brush it off. It was probably a joke, some bored coworker trying to kill time. But the number 237 was familiar. It was the sealed filing cabinet in the darkest corner of the room, the one no one had opened in years. Why couldn't I stop staring at that number? Should I open it? I asked myself quietly. The sound of my own voice echoed in the empty basement, and suddenly, the place felt much larger than it really was. Cabinet 237 had been there since I started working in the archive 3 years ago. I never thought much about it. It was just a gray metal piece sitting in a poorly lit corner. The hinges were rusty, and the lock seemed more symbolic than functional. Maybe no one bothered to open it because, after all, what could be inside? More moldy papers, probably. But now, with the note still in my hand, the cabinet seemed different. It wasn't just an abandoned piece of furniture. It was a puzzle, and puzzles always intrigued me. Before doing anything, I forced myself to return to my desk. Maybe it was just a prank, a coworker trying to get a laugh at my expense. Or worse, it could be something more serious, a security test. Working with old documents meant dealing with sensitive information from time to time, and if someone caught me snooping where I shouldn't be, I could lose my job. But the truth was, curiosity had already won. I'd always been like this. Even in school, I couldn't ignore unanswered questions. If a teacher mentioned something intriguing without explaining, I'd spend hours in the library researching. You seem more distracted than usual. The voice snapped me out of my thoughts. It was Jake from IT. He had that casual vibe only someone who knew they could walk out at any moment and get a better job had. "It's just the heat," I lied. "Yeah, this basement feels like an oven in the summer." "Hey, have you ever opened that cabinet in the corner? I've always wondered why it's locked." I looked at him, trying to gauge whether he knew more than he was letting on. But Jake just shrugged, cracked a joke about slow systems, and left before I could respond. Alone again, I turned my gaze back to the cabinet. I decided to act. I walked over to the corner of the room, trying not to make a sound. My hands were a bit sweaty, and the sound of the lock as I touched, it seemed too loud in the oppressive silence. The lock, as I suspected, wasn't really locked. With a bit of force, I managed to open it. The door of the cabinet creaked as it opened, revealing something very different from what I expected. Inside was a single wooden box, covered in dust. On the lid, a number was carved by hand with something that looked like a blade. 0456A. Below the number, another message. Confidential property. Do not open without authorization. My heart started racing. What was this? Documents? Something forgotten there? Or worse, something someone wanted kept hidden. I sat on the floor and carefully pulled the box out. It was heavier than it looked. It wasn't large, maybe the size of a small suitcase, but the dense wood and its contents made it awkward to handle. When I finally set it on the floor, I slowly opened the lid. The smell was the first thing that hit me. It wasn't just old paper. It was something more. Metallic, almost chemical. Inside there was a collection of envelopes and small notebooks. Each one was marked with numbers and dates from the 1970s. I picked up the first envelope and opened it. Inside were a series of photos. Black and white images poorly lit of places that looked like basements or abandoned rooms. What caught my attention was the pattern. In every photo, there was a chair in the center of the room, always empty. But it was the last notebook that really made me stop. Its cover was marked with the same number as the box, 0456A, and the first page had only one handwritten sentence. "Whoever finds this knows too much." I spent the rest of the day unable to shake the box from my mind. Every time I thought about going back to the cabinet and putting everything back, something inside me resisted. It felt as though the message in the notebook was less of a threat and more of a challenge. That night, at the kitchen table with the box open in front of me, I began examining the contents more closely. The photos were even more disturbing under the fluorescent light. The places in the photos were empty, but there was something about the angles, the shadows. Like the absence was more threatening than any presence. The notebooks were the real mystery. Some were filled with small, rushed handwriting. Most seemed like a diary, with detailed descriptions of people, times, and locations. But none of the information made sense. It was like reading a fragmented story. March 17, 1974. Contact made. He seems to understand the risk, but insists on proceeding. Not sure how long it will take before he realizes the mistake. Contact with who? Realize what? Another excerpt. June 24, 1976. 2 missing. Procedure followed, but something went wrong. We need to review the protocol before this happens again. What stood out was the frequency of the entries. They stopped abruptly in 1981, as though someone had abandoned the project or been forced to abandon it. I paused when I found a smaller envelope stuck at the bottom of the box. Inside were a set of different photos. These weren't of places. They were of people. Men and women, smiling at the camera. Next to each face was a name and a date. All were dated between 1973 and 1980. But what gave me chills was noticing something common to all the photos. Most of the people had a subtle, almost imperceptible mark on their necks. The next day, I took a few photos with me. I wasn't sure why, but I felt like I needed answers. I casually showed one to Jake. "Do you recognize anyone in this picture?" Jake squinted at the photo. "No, but..." "Wait, this is... Wow, this looks old. Where did you get this?" "It's a long story," I mumbled, pulling the photo back. Later, I used a break to search for the names of the people in the work's digital files. Most of them didn't show up anywhere, as if they'd never existed. But one name stood out: Karen Hensley. A brief 1980 newspaper article mentioned her disappearance. She was 29, a social worker, last seen at a diner near her home. After that, nothing. A chill ran down my spine. That night, the phone rang while I was reviewing the notes. I didn't recognize the number, but I answered anyway. "You shouldn't have messed with that," a male voice said. My blood ran cold. "Who are you?" "Someone giving you a warning. Leave it where you found it. Forget what you saw." Before I could respond, the line went silent. I stood there, holding the phone, my mind racing. Who was that? How did they know I was messing with the box? The idea of returning it seemed reasonable, but something told me that if I did, I'd be trapped in the questions forever. It was too late to back down. I spent the night awake. The voice on the phone wasn't from someone playing around. The threat was implicit, but clear enough to make me seriously consider dropping everything. Yet, each time I thought about returning the box, something else kept me from doing it. The incomplete story, the faces in the photos, the names without answers. The next morning, I decided to take a different path. I went to the local newspaper, the same one Jake worked at, and asked for access to the physical archives. I wanted to investigate any mentions of the people in the notebooks or photos. It was a tedious process, but the feeling that I was on the right track kept me going. 2 hours later, I found something. A small 1979 article mentioned a series of unexplained disappearances in our town. The headline was blunt: "Where are the missing?" There weren't many details, just a list of names. Karen Hensley was one of them. What was even more intriguing was the mention of a man named Harris Lockwood, described as an influential figure in the city at the time. He was listed as one of the last people to see some of the missing, but there was never any evidence linking him to their disappearances. Harris Lockwood. The name made my skin crawl. It was written in one of the notebooks from the box, scribbled several times, as if someone wanted to make sure it wouldn't be forgotten. Jake showed up at the newspaper around noon. I pulled him aside and showed him the article. "Ever heard of this guy, Harris Lockwood?" Jake scratched his head, thinking. "No, wait, maybe. My grandfather mentioned the name. I think he used to own some old properties around here, but sold them all and disappeared. Why are you asking?" I explained vaguely that I was looking into the old disappearances. Jake gave me a curious look, but didn't push. "If you want to know more, maybe the library has something. They keep files we don't have here." The municipal library was an old building, with long hallways lined with dusty shelves. I requested access to the microfilm of old newspapers and began sifting through them. It took almost 3 hours before I found something substantial. A 1981 article reported the sudden disappearance of Harris Lockwood. He had left behind his main house and a secluded rural property on the outskirts of town. The main house had been demolished years ago, but the rural property was still listed as his, although abandoned. The place was called Redwood Farm, and it seemed wrapped in rumors and local stories. There was a second detail that deeply bothered me, a mention of a safe found in Lockwood's main house before its demolition. The article said the safe was locked and sent to a police storage, but there were no further details. It was too much of a coincidence. That night, I went home feeling like someone was watching me. The whole time, I kept looking over my shoulder, but the street was empty. Even so, the feeling of being followed didn't go away. When I got home, I locked the door and closed the curtains. I sat at the kitchen table again, spreading out the photos and notebooks in front of me. The pieces were starting to connect, but there were still too many gaps. Around 10, my phone buzzed. A text message from an unknown number, Redwood Farm. Tomorrow? You want answers? It's there. My heart skipped a beat. There was no ignoring it. Someone knew what I was doing, maybe even knew more than I did. But who would send such a message? The voice on the phone had clearly wanted me to back off. The only thing I knew for sure was that I was no longer in control of the situation. The next morning, the sky was gray, and the air had that heavy stillness that precedes a storm. Redwood Farm. The name echoed in my head like an endless reverberation. I didn't know what I would find there, but it was clear that the answers I was looking for were hidden at that forgotten property. Before leaving, I stopped by the local police station. I used the excuse of doing a piece on abandoned properties to ask about Redwood Farm. The officer at the front desk, a burly man named Sloan, frowned when he heard the name. Redwood Farm? No one's been there in decades. The place's ruin. They say the owner, that Lockwood guy, left a trail of trouble before he disappeared. Why are you interested? I changed the subject, thanked him, and left. Despite his casual tone, Sloane's comment hinted at something more. He knew or suspected that something was wrong with that place. The drive to the property took about 40 minutes. The road was a rough dirt path surrounded by trees. The closer I got, the more the discomfort grew. Redwood Farm wasn't just a place. It was a symbol of something the town wanted to forget. When the rusty gate came into view, I had to take a deep breath. I got out of the car and pushed it open, hearing the metal creak as if protesting my presence. The property was shrouded in silence, except for the rustling of the wind in the trees. The main house was a decrepit structure, with broken windows and a roof partially caved in. Next to it, an even more deteriorated barn looked ready to collapse. I started with the house. The front door was unlocked, and when I pushed it open, the smell of mold and decay hit me. Inside, the floor creaked under my feet. Every step seemed too loud, as if the place itself was listening. There were furniture pieces covered with dirty sheets and papers scattered everywhere. In the corner of the room, an old, worn-out armchair faced a stone fireplace. It felt like a staged scene, an attempt to preserve a story that no one wanted to tell anymore. Upstairs, the rooms were empty except for one. Inside, there was a bed with no mattress and a small table with something carved into the wood. They'll never let you go. I tried not to think too much about it, but as I explored, something started to feel wrong. Each room seemed to contain small items out of place. A tipped-over glass, a newspaper open to a specific page, a photograph torn in half. In the barn, the discomfort reached its peak. The dirt floor was covered with recent footprints, footsteps that weren't mine. The barn's interior structure was partially collapsed, but in the center, there was an opening in the floor, covered by a heavy wooden door. I pushed the door open with difficulty, revealing a staircase that descended into darkness. A wave of hesitation hit me. This was the point of no return. I grabbed my flashlight and slowly descended the stairs, feeling the air grow heavier. The smell down there was unbearable. A mix of dampness and something else. Something metallic and acidic. The underground space was small, but it was filled with wooden boxes, similar to the one I'd found at home. One of them was open, revealing more notebooks and photographs, but now there was something additional. Videotapes. I picked up one of the tapes and read the label. Just a date. 03041980. As I looked around, the sound of footsteps above made my heart stop. Someone was in the barn. I turned off the flashlight and held my breath. The steps were slow, deliberate, as if the person knew I was there. I gripped the tape tightly and started climbing the stairs, trying not to make a sound. When I reached the top, I saw a vague figure near the barn entrance. I couldn't see its face, but I knew it was watching me. I did the only thing I could. I ran. When I got to the car, I jumped in, slammed the door, and started the engine while the figure remained still, unmoving. My heart raced as I sped down the road, leaving Redwood Farm behind. When I got home, locking all the doors and windows, I put the tape into an old VCR I'd kept. The image was grainy but visible. It showed an empty room with concrete walls. In the center, a chair. Strapped to the chair was a man, his eyes wide with terror. He was saying something, but I couldn't hear because soon after, a shadow entered the frame and the tape cut off abruptly. My hands were shaking. Whatever that was, it was beyond what I could process at that moment. But one thing was certain. There were people who didn't want these answers to come to light. And now I was part of it. After that night, my life became a tangle of paranoia and uncertainty. I went to work the next day, trying to act as if nothing had happened, but my mind couldn't stop replaying the images from that tape. The man in the chair, the shadow moving like a predator around him. Deeper research into Redwood Farm revealed very little. The property had been owned by someone named Edward Lockwood, a local businessman who mysteriously disappeared in 1980. There was no mention of what happened to his family or the farm workers. It was as if all records had been erased. I knew I needed to learn more, but my attempts to investigate were starting to attract attention. When I stopped by a cafe downtown to look through old newspaper archives, I realized I was being watched. Across the counter, a man in a dark jacket and a scruffy beard sipped his coffee, his eyes fixed on me. When I stared back, he didn't look away. He just tilted his head slightly, as if to say, "Yes, I see you." My stomach churned. I paid the bill and left quickly, but as I walked to my car, I noticed footsteps behind me. It wasn't my imagination. My breath quickened as I crossed the empty parking lot. The sound of footsteps grew closer. When I turned to face whoever it was, the man was there, standing just a few feet away, with an expression that mixed contempt and threat. "You should stop this," he said, his voice low but firm. "Who are you? Why are you following me?" I asked, trying to sound confident, but my voice shook. He didn't respond. He just took a step forward. "Seriously, Redwood Farm isn't your problem. Don't make it worse for yourself." Before I could react, he turned and disappeared around a corner. When I got home, I locked all the doors and windows again. The tape was still in the VCR, but I knew I couldn't leave it there. I grabbed my camera and filmed the screen, copying the content to my computer. I spent hours rewatching the recording, trying to catch something that could give me a clue. A mark on the wall, a muffled sound, anything. But it was always the same. The man strapped to the chair, the shadow, and the abrupt cut in the video. The dates on the other tapes were older, all from before 1980. I knew I needed to watch them, but the fear of discovering what they contained paralyzed me. In the middle of the night, something woke me. A faint dragging sound coming from the living room. I grabbed a knife from the kitchen and went toward it, trying to control my breathing. The front door was ajar. Every fiber of my being screamed for me to run, but instead, I moved forward slowly. There was no one in the living room, but the papers on my desk were scattered. The videotape was gone. Whoever had entered wasn't interested in stealing. They wanted to send me a message. I went to the window and looked outside, but the street was empty. Only the cold autumn wind moved the trees. That night was the breaking point. I realized I wasn't just dealing with old secrets. There were real people who would do anything to protect what was buried in Redwood Farm. But instead of giving up, something inside me hardened. It wasn't just about discovering the truth anymore. Now it was personal. I knew that every move from here on out had to be calculated. It wasn't just an investigation anymore. It was a fight to stay alive. Redwood Farm had stopped being just an investigative journalism project. It had become a minefield, and I was the intruder who needed to get out before I was swallowed. But I couldn't ignore the truth. The next few days, I isolated myself. I worked remotely, avoided public places, and alternated between paranoia and determination. The stolen tape had left me at a disadvantage, but I still had the digitized file on my computer. I decided to focus on the images, watching each frame with obsessive attention. That's when I noticed something new. There was a reflection, almost imperceptible, in the lower right corner of the screen. A piece of metal briefly shining in the light. When I zoomed in, I could make out what looked like a rusty plate nailed to the concrete wall. The letters were worn, but I was able to decipher Redwood and a number that appeared to be an identification code. The recording wasn't just a random tape. It had been made on the farm itself. I spent the whole night cross-referencing information. I found records of old constructions on the property. In the 1970s, an underground bunker had been installed, supposedly as a shelter for workers in case of storms or emergencies. It was an important discovery, but it also meant I'd need to go back to the farm. The next morning, I packed the essentials: a flashlight, a pocket knife, a fully charged cell phone, and a camera to document anything I found. I arrived at Redwood Farm as night fell, parking my car far enough away so I wouldn't be seen. The place was quieter than I remembered, but the feeling of being watched was still there, like an invisible weight in the air. I followed the maps I found in the records, and after nearly an hour of walking through the uneven terrain, I saw something. A rusty hatch, hidden under dry leaves and branches. With considerable effort, I managed to open the hatch. Below, there was a metal ladder that descended into complete darkness. My flashlight illuminated narrow concrete walls, marked with rust and water stains. The air was heavy, thick with the smell of mold mixed with something older and metallic. The tunnel led to a steel door. In the center, an old but sturdy padlock. I used the pocket knife to force the lock, which gave with a sharp snap. Behind the door, I found a small, almost claustrophobic space. In the center, there was a wooden chair, exactly like the one in the video. Around it, old cameras were positioned on rusty stands, all aimed at the chair. And there was blood. The floor was stained with dark, dried marks that told stories I didn't want to hear. On the walls, small holes suggested that other things had been there. But what was most disturbing was what I found in a corner: a table with papers, tapes, and something that looked like a ledger. The ledger contained names. A long list from the 1970s to the early 1980s. The last name on the list was Edward Lockwood, with the word "completed" next to it. I swallowed hard, trying to organize my thoughts. Something had happened there, something horrible. And clearly, someone still cared enough to keep it all buried. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed through the tunnel. Someone was there. I turned off the flashlight and hid behind the table, my heart pounding in my chest. The lights in the tunnel were off, but I could hear a man's voice, low and calm. "I told you to stop." The sound of metal scraping on the floor made me realize he wasn't alone. The voice in the tunnel made my body freeze. He was closer now, footsteps echoing in the darkness, like hammer blows on a drum. My heart was beating so loud, I feared he would hear it. "You really don't know when to stop, do you?" The voice sounded almost tired, but the tone was deadly. I couldn't answer. I couldn't move. The table in front of me seemed as thin as paper. It offered barely any protection, but it was all I had. I heard the sound of something being set down on the floor, probably his flashlight. Then, the metallic click of a gun being cocked. Adrenaline surged. My options were few, but the decision was clear: fight or flee. I silently grabbed the camera, my trembling fingers ready to fire the flash. It was my only chance to disorient him enough to escape. I waited until he was almost on top of me, until I felt his presence just behind the table. Then, I pressed the button. A bright flash illuminated the space. The man screamed in surprise, and in that instant, I threw the table at him, knocking him to the ground. I ran toward the tunnel, not looking back, as his shouts and footsteps chased me. The tunnel seemed endless, but I knew I had to reach the hatch. Every step I took felt heavier, the air growing thicker as panic set in. Finally, I saw the faint light coming from the exit. I used all my strength to climb the ladder, but when I reached the top, I felt a hand grab my ankle. "You're not leaving here." I instinctively twisted my body, kicking hard. My foot hit something, and I heard a cry of pain. I climbed the last steps, closed the hatch, and looked for anything to block it. I found a large, heavy rock. I pushed it with all my strength onto the hatch, trapping it. From below, I could hear fists pounding and angry shouts, but the sounds began to fade. I didn't wait to see if he would find another way out. I ran to the car, stumbling and almost falling several times. When I reached the vehicle, my breath was ragged and uneven. I started the engine with trembling hands and sped away, leaving the farm behind. On the drive back home, my thoughts were a jumbled mix of fear and anger, not just at the risks I had taken, but for the lives that had been destroyed in that place. I knew it wasn't over. The original tape was gone, but the photos and videos I'd taken in the bunker would be enough to keep investigating, as long as I wasn't caught before then. Still, one question kept nagging at me. Who was that man? And why was he so determined to protect whatever happened at Redwood Farm? As I entered the city, I drove past my apartment and went to a cheap hotel, paying in cash. I didn't want to risk being found. While copying the images to a hard drive, an anonymous message appeared on my phone. "You got lucky today. You won't next time." I stared at the screen for long seconds. They were still watching me. The following week was a blur of paranoia and planning. I spent days hopping between cheap hotels, always with a backpack full of clothes, my laptop, and the hard drive containing the evidence from Redwood Farm. Every car that passed slowly made me hold my breath. Every unfamiliar face on the street felt like a potential threat. The material I saved was strong, but I knew it wouldn't be enough. The images of the tunnels, the identification plates, the equipment. They were clear evidence that something illegal had happened there, but without the full context, without the original tape, it wouldn't be enough to bring down those responsible. I sent copies to trusted contacts, independent journalists, human rights advocates, even a retired detective who'd worked on corruption cases involving large corporations. They responded with interest, but also with caution. Everyone understood that messing with this meant risking a lot. I knew I couldn't do everything on my own, but I also couldn't stop. One night, while reviewing the images again, I noticed something I had missed before. An inscription on one of the tunnel walls, partially obscured by dust and rust. The truth will be buried. It was a brutal reminder that those who built that place had no intention of letting anything be uncovered. They relied on silence from the victims, the accomplices, the people who knew too much. And now they were counting on mine. That same night, I woke up to the sound of knocks on the door. 3 sharp raps, followed by complete silence. I looked through the peephole, but the hallway was empty. Even so, my body froze. It was a warning, clear and direct. I had already received messages and threats, but this felt different. They were getting closer. The next morning, I grabbed my backpack and drove to the city police station. It was the only way to make sure the story was told. I handed over a copy of the images and wrote a detailed statement about everything I had seen. The officer who took my statement seemed skeptical, but assured me the material would be reviewed. I knew it was unlikely anything would happen right away, but I had to take the risk. As I left the station, a phrase came to mind, something I had read somewhere. The truth doesn't die, but those who carry it do, and I was carrying far more than I was prepared to bear. It's been a year since I left Redwood Farm behind, but the ghosts of that place are still with me. Not literally, of course ghosts are easy to explain. It's the guilt and fear that follow me like a shadow, haunting every decision I make. The story got some media attention, but not the way I imagined. An independent website published an in-depth article based on the images and statements I sent, but without the weight of a major outlet. The impact was limited. There was interest, but also resistance, the kind that arises when uncomfortable truths challenge powerful interests. The hard drive with the files mysteriously disappeared from where I had stored it. The police never gave me a satisfactory explanation, just an empty promise to investigate. I went back to journalism, but I avoid big stories now. I stick to smaller, safer work restaurant reviews, profiles of local business owners. Nothing that would draw too much attention. But every time I'm alone, a chill runs through me as I remember Redwood Farm. Not for what I saw, but for what I couldn't prove. Sometimes I think about Amy, wondering if she ever found peace somewhere. And all the other names I'll never know, lives that ended in the darkness of a tunnel, silenced by people who are still walking free. Today, as I finished writing this account, I received a text message. The number was unknown. You've been heard. Keep talking, and it will be the last time. I deleted the message immediately, but the weight of the words remained. The truth is still there, buried with the victims of Redwood Farm. Maybe I'll never fully unearth it, but I refuse to forget it, because someone needs to remember.